that he could not allow his military operations to get bogged down in the face of fortifications, and that meant that he needed techniques and weaponry that could attack fortifications.
With mammoth walls and a fortified harbor and very little land around the walls, the city of Tyre was long thought to be impregnable. Thus, Alexander resolved to a very, very ambitious approach. He knew he couldn't take the city unless he did damage to the walls. So he had his engineers build a causeway, a bridge from the mainland to the island. Causeway was about half-mile long, 200 feet wide, 20 feet high. When the causeway was within striking distance, Alexander unleashed a hail of terror on the city, and then he deployed the only weapon he knew would end the battle, a siege tower.
The towers were a kind of multi-storied armored car that moved forward on wheels. Outside, they were fireproofed with rawhide, covering the entire wooden structure. Inside, a central staircase led to a series of platforms where oxabeles and other catapults launched missiles onto Tyre's walls. Down below, others used the tower as protection to wield a ground-level battering ram.
They'd literally wheel them up to the wall. The men inside would be protected, and they would be shooting arrows at the defenders on the wall and trying to cross over onto the wall and to kill the defenders.
Alexander's siege towers pummeled the walls of Tyre for days. Once the fortress had been breached, Alexander went for the jugular. He unleashed a firestorm of reprisal upon the city that had resisted him.
The assault itself would really be a terrifying experience for everyone involved. The only way to signal would be through trumpets, so you have to imagine trumpets blaring, a tremendous noise of men attacking, flags blowing in the wind on the battlements of the city that was under attack. I think it would have been an extraordinary scene.
Alexander resumed his trek southward through Palestine. His confidence soaring, he now set his sights on the greatest empire the world had ever seen, Egypt. With its soaring pyramids and unrivaled colossal tombs, Egypt was an ancient culture Alexander revered. But there was another more practical reason Alexander coveted Egypt. It was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, whose wheat fields would be invaluable in feeding Alexander's expanding empire. But unlike Tyre, conquering the Egyptians required no bloodshed.
Alexander entered Egypt as a liberator and as a figure of extraordinary powers.
The Egyptians not only welcomed Alexander, they made him a god. In 331 BC, they crowned Alexander pharaoh, proclaiming him a son of Ammon, their most important deity. At age 24, Alexander had transcended mortality.
One can imagine that someone to whom extraordinary things happened, to whom all doors seemed to open themselves magically, to whom every endeavor was rewarded with victory, would think, well, perhaps I am, in some respect, a god. And I think that Alexander really did think this. He wasn't just pretending. He was trying to find out more about himself.
By the late 4th century BC, Greek cities were springing up in the wake of Alexander's marauding army. These cities served as centers of control and administration, but more importantly, they became a means of spreading a unifying fabric of Greek language, culture, and learning. The result would be a template of city engineering that would extend to the farthest regions of Alexander's empire. Alexander ordered that his soldiers be clean-shaven so that enemies couldn't grab their beards in close combat. By 325 BC, Alexander had extended his borders almost 3,000 miles from Greece in the west to modern-day India in the east. Alexander's army may have been a wrecking machine, but the legacy his empire left in its wake was a new Greek world. Alexander's strategy for ruling conquered nations included both accommodation and assimilation. He often left soldiers behind a vision of ideals that formed a hybrid culture that became known as Hellenism.
So definitely there are striking parallels with what's going on today, in our today era of globalization. Today we have a common language, which is English, is the language of trade. After Alexander the Great, you have people who have adopted the Greek customs and the Greek language.
Hellenism was built on city life, and nowhere did this expansion of Greek domination show up more so than in city planning. Whether they were beginning a new city or reshaping an old one, as the empire grew, Alexander's engineers laid it out on a grid plan that the Greeks had used since the 5th century BC.
The grid plan, which was used in these cities, was a symbol of order. Any government that could replace the traditional winding alleyways of a city with a rectilineal grid plan of streets at right angles was a government to be feared, a government to take notice of.
Alexander's campaigns in Asia Minor would create a new world order. Today we call it Hellenism. If you lived in a city conquered by Alexander, you lived in a Greek city. This is an example of such a city. It's called Pergamum. 2,000 years ago, Pergamum would have had all the elements of a Greek city: agora, temples, gymnasium, theater.
Were the palaces and temples?
The city rises about 1,000 feet above sea level, which necessitated a series of complex and extensive terraces. In Hellenistic times, Athens was no longer the power center that it was before. There was a shift toward other cities of importance. In that vacuum, Pergamum rose to power.
In some ways, it's an echo of the Acropolis of Athens, where the temples stand on a hill, a natural rock over the city. And no expense is spared in building splendid temples and splendid public buildings in Pergamum. And so Greek city planning begins earlier than Alexander, but it's taken to perfection in the Hellenistic period. Wherever you go, each of them has a recognizable institution. Each of them will have a Greek theater. Each of them will have Greek temples. Each of them will have a gymnasium. Each of them will have a agora, a marketplace come forum.
The focal point of a Greek city could be found in its public marketplace, called the agora. Here, merchants would peddle their daily wares, and citizens would congregate to discuss the political issues of the day. Adjacent to the agora was the stoa, a simple structure that was the equivalent of an ancient indoor mall. The stoa consisted of a colonnade on one side with a back wall on the other, a shelter providing an open space that was still protected from the elements. The agora and the stoas were the economic, public, and political heart of the Hellenistic city, but its cultural soul lay in another engineering marvel, and was arguably the most important in Hellenistic cities: the theater.
The theater is basically an Athenian invention. Drama is, above all, democratic. It develops in Athens concomitantly with the Athenian democracy.
Theater was an essential and very important aspect of the Greek outlook to the world, how they thought of themselves and how they thought of the world. And I think to many people's opinion, is one of the great legacies that the ancient Greek civilization has bestowed upon us today.
Theaters in ancient Greece were not only forums of social commentary, they inspired the Romans in their building of colosseums and set the standard of stadium design for the next 2,000 years.
Separate your men by tribe, by clan, such that clan may bear aid to clan and tribe to tribe. Thus spake Nestor to Agamemnon in the Iliad. And those words might have been said here, because one of the great gifts of Greek culture to the world is theater and music. This is a Greek theater at Pergamum. It is the steepest of its kind. Now, a Broadway theater, and I've played in a few, holds between 800 or 900 people and maybe 2,000 if it's a musical house. This theater holds thousands and thousands and thousands of spectators. So how in the heck can an actor stand on that stage and project his voice such as that the spectator in the very last row at the back of this theater can hear what he's saying? Well, the answer is sort of an engineering feat. The theater, first of all, is dug out of the side of a mountain, and it doesn't need a very big substructure because the side of the mountain provides the support for these stone benches. Second of all, the theater is in a semicircle, and the semicircle gives way to an amazing sense of acoustics. You can stand on that stage and you can almost whisper, and someone in the very back row would hear you as if you were speaking right into his ear because the sound would bounce off the back wall. Third thing is that the actors wore masks. And these masks not only function as character, but they also function as sort of a megaphone through the lips. So these three elements combined, this theater would be a fantastic place to come and hear the Agamemnon performed by Aeschylus.
I think undoubtedly the best preserved ancient Greek theater, the theater at Epidauros in the Argolid Peninsula in the Peloponnesus.
Greek theaters were divided into three basic parts: the theatron, or viewing area in which the audience sat; the orchestra, or dancing area in which most of the action took place; and the skene, a timber building set behind the orchestra. The skene and its flat roof were used for dressing rooms, as a backdrop, and sometimes for staging scenes. The theater at Epidauros has 55 rows of seats and is divided into three horizontal seating sections. Stairs divide the sections of seats into separate wedges. In all, this giant theater has an estimated seating capacity of 12,000 to 14,000 people. But it's the acoustical engineering that makes the theater at Epidauros clearly spectacular.
If you're sitting up in the top row, you're a long way away from the stage. And the person who's down in the orchestra or on the stage looks quite tiny. And yet, you can have a conversation with that person with only a slight elevation of your voice.
In just 10 years, Alexander had set the stage for Greek culture to dominate the world. But empires and their leaders eventually fall. Alexander was no exception. His untimely end would give rise to kings and kingdoms whose engineering feats would be considered ancient wonders of the world. In 326 BC, Alexander founded the city of Bucephala in honor of his slain horse. By 323 BC, Alexander had forged an empire that spread from Greece in the west down through Egypt and to India in the east. His conquests hinged on his army's use of advanced technology, but they also depended on Alexander's legendary ability to command the loyalty of thousands of men. But after 13 years and thousands of miles of constant warfare, that loyalty was stretched to the breaking point.
His troops, their loyalty finally was used up. They rebelled against him. They refused to go further, and he had to turn around.
While returning from India, Alexander was preparing to consolidate his empire when he was struck by a mysterious illness.
No one knows exactly what it was that killed him, whether it was an infection, whether it was the result of a very hard life as a soldier in which he was wounded in battle, these extraordinary travels in which he, according to legend, subjected himself to the same hardships as his soldiers. One of the stories is that he essentially drank himself to death. There was always intrigue at the Macedonian court. Alexander's father had been assassinated. Is it possible that he was poisoned in some way? Those are questions we can't answer.
On June 10, 323 BC, just 1 month shy of 33 years old, the most powerful man on earth was dead. Now the stunning rise of his sudden empire would be matched by its spectacular and bloody fragmentation. A power struggle between the regional commanders quickly ensued to fill the void left by Alexander's death. These generals